So yeah, hello everyone. I'm Paul. I'm the education lead for the Ministry of Eco Education, and we're a charity supporting teachers to weave sustainability through their teaching. And we think about sustainability in its really broadest sense. And I think actually this topic we're going to talk about this afternoon is what some people might start to think of as the sort of fringes of sustainability, but we'll see where the discussion goes. So at the Ministry of Eco Education, we've brought together resources and opportunities from hundreds of different organisations into learning journeys framed by big questions. And those big questions, some examples that link with the discussion we're going to have are things like, do people in other countries matter? Who is in charge? Should ecocide be law? And we've also got one that we quite like called, Is the Future Already Written? Now, today we're going to be exploring the question of, well, educators, war, and the climate crisis. How can teachers link war and the climate crisis? And we're joined by a wonderful panel with Grace, Jinsella, and Sari. And we're going to start in a moment with each of the panelists sharing their initial responses to the question before we open it up to the wider discussion and questions. So please feel free, at any moment, add in any questions that you might think of or any thoughts into the chat. So please feel free to use that. Now, to give the discussion a bit of a wider context, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, global military spending has increased to $2,887 billion in 2025. And that's the 11th year of consecutive rises. And it brings the global military burden, which is the military expenditure as a share of global gross domestic product, to about 2.5%. And that's its highest level since 2009. Now, a recent study in The Lancet also estimated that at least 75,200 people had died violently during the Gaza war. And the research also suggests that about an additional 8,000 people were killed non-violently during the period. Um, Now, that was linked to things like malnutrition and illness. And the other striking thing to say is also that women, children, and elderly people made up about 56% of those who were violently killed, underscoring the toll on civilians. Now, satellite imagery also shows the environmental impact of the war, and by March 2024, nearly half of the farmland in Gaza had been destroyed, and by the following January, about 80% of the tree cover had been destroyed. So, aside from all of those figures, the total military carbon footprint is estimated at about 5.5% of global emissions, and that excludes greenhouse gases from conflict and war. So that's just sort of them operating without conflict. The US military itself is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases of any institution on Earth. And if it were a country, it would make the US military 47th globally in emissions, and that would be ahead of nations like Sweden and Portugal. So, what do all these figures really communicate about our collective attitude to people and the rest of nature? And with all the media attention on global conflict, how can teachers better engage and help young people to understand the links between war and the climate and planetary crisis? Where are the opportunities in the curriculum? Where are there maybe opportunities for teachers to be able to easily link this? But also, why is it important for education to critically engage with ideas of militarism? So, I'd like to start by inviting Jinsella Kennaway, co-founder of Demilitarise Education. They are a community of modern day peacemakers who untangle, expose, and end university ties to the global arms trade. And one of the things that Ginsella's done a lot of work at collectively is building the world's first university in arms database to benchmark how peaceful universities are. So, welcome, Jinsella. Would you like to start?
Sure. Thank you, Paul, and hello, everybody. Um, a little bit more about demilitarized education. So, as Paul said, we've built the world's first university and arms database. And this means we are tracking university partnerships, research partnerships, academic partnerships, and investment partnerships with arms companies. So far, in aggregate across the UK, we have exposed over £2.5 billion worth of military and arms trade partnerships in the higher education system. That right there is the pinnacle start of my discussion around this question. These are our great knowledge centers. They are our great research hubs. And more so, they are places of community. They're places where young people, young adults, and students of all ages are able to come together to build political awareness, to build cultural awareness, and beyond. Importantly, beyond the culture, it's also where technology is moving forward. It's where our knowledge is being directed into the industries that we want to advance. And right now, the higher education space is being bought out. And that is very much in favor of a military, war-led agenda. So when we're thinking about education and how teachers can really link the war crisis that we're in with the climate crisis, I believe we should be thinking very economically. But to do that, we need to understand how we are ideologically being shifted into the normalization and giving social license to the war economy through our lower, secondary, and higher education systems. Now, I have to point you to Forces Watch. They have done incredible research looking into how the UK government is now spending around £200 million a year promoting military ethos in schools. This is a huge recruitment haul that is very manipulatively taking place with our children. I got an email from a worried mother in Lossiemouth a few years ago because Lossiemouth High School has now renamed their school houses after RAF fighter jets. One of the houses is called Typhoon. And that kind of gives you some awareness around how cultural this military agenda is and how far the war economy has reached into our education. When we get to higher education, where my research focuses, we're looking at autonomous weapon systems being built at Imperial University. We're looking at the new nuclear warheads, Australia, being built at Sheffield University, and so on. What I believe teachers can be doing with their students on a day-to-day basis is, first of all, understanding that the arms trade and this war agenda is designed to uphold the political elite. And I know you can't really get into those discussions much in the classroom, but it is really relevant for helping us to understand, why are we spending £60.2 billion on defence, as stated by Parliament in 2024 and 2025. And the climate crisis is scooped in with our aid budget and is at a much lower rate. Not to mention conflict prevention. Where is our conflict prevention budget? It's minuscule in comparison to our defence budget. And I have to say defence because it is very much an imperialist budget. And of course, that's looking to grow. They've now committed to 5% of our GDP going towards defence. Well, how is it defending people in their day-to-day lives? How is it actually helping us to go beyond a very reactionary security system and thinking about radical change to our economy and culture that means care for people and planet are put first? That happens, I believe, with really understanding how toxic the whole arms, the whole war supply chain is. To start with, the arms industry is in places like Congo, extracting uranium. There's then huge research time lags. Some projects will be developed for 10, 20 years, which of course has a massive resource suck. Then there's the transportation of these huge machineries, fighter jets, missiles, and so on. Then you have the use, which by nature is incredibly violent and destructive. And then the cleanup, which never really happens. It's, the use of these weapons might destroy a water system, and no one's there or available. There's no infrastructure for people then to go in and clean up. So we have to look at the way that war economy is destructive to the environment at every level, but also how that then feeds into a culture of the status quo and accepting the status quo. We continue to give that social license. We continue to believe that this is the only way the world is going to work, and this is the only way we can protect ourselves against threats. Um, okay, I realize I've not given anything very practical yet for teachers. Um, and my research, as I said, is slightly away from that. So the major thing I want to say to teachers is that by offering hope, understanding that there is huge amount of our government budgets going into persuading and recruiting young people to the military from a young age. And there needs to be space in our education system to counter that, to say, okay, yes, this is the way that our security is currently being managed, but it is not the only way we can do that, and creating space for hope beyond the normalization of perpetual war. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think some really interesting comments there. I think what is interesting is placing education in this spectrum and saying universities are an important sort of pathway, kind of part of this. I know also there's the military involvement in a lot of technical colleges, particularly even in part funding or running them. But I think also that sense of there are people in schools who are going to be channeled into pathways which lead them to doing engineering or doing taking university careers that then almost naturally, because of the way the system's set up, feed them into the military. I also, one of the things you were saying there reminded me of a push for there being a greater involvement of cadet forces in schools. I think it was 2012 there was government funding to expand them. And actually, I've just did a bit of research, and the recent Defence Review proposed or recommended a 30% expansion in school and community-based cadet forces by 2030, aiming for 250,000 cadets in the long term. And I think the way that schools engage with cadet forces or their kind of perception of those, I think is an interesting point that we could maybe discuss further. The other one that came to mind, Jinsella, sorry, I'm keen for you to come back to some of these things as well, but careers fairs. And I think that's also an avenue that begins in schools, is the normalization of the military and careers fairs, which at university is even more heightened. And that may be because research is happening through or funded by in that you're describing there. But yeah, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, it's just so important to be talking about the Defence Strategic Review. Right now, the government has just opened application for a new charter on the University Alliance. Um, and this is all a part of their what do they call it? They're all in. They're all in strategy for defense. They're trying to make defense the engine, is the exact word they use, of our economy. And I think that's really despicable. That's a very clear image of what we don't want. We don't want our economy to be reliant on war. We do not want our economy and our security to be reliant on these technologies when in reality we don't even have food security in the UK right now. And I think that's a really interesting way to work with young people as well, thinking about like, what do you want to do with your life? How do you imagine your future? And then thinking about how, okay, if we make our economy dependent on the arms trade, is that actually working in parallel with your dreams and ambitions for our society or not? And yeah, the recruitment is really horrendous, to be honest. It's happening from such a young age. I'm getting messages from people who have had the RAF in their food tech classes in year seven, and so on. The changing armed forces day from Veteran Day was a part of that. So it was more welcoming to invite children to come and hold guns and to normalize their uh, relationship with a militarized society. And yeah, the cadets, it's like a super fun thing for children to do. You get to go out to school and fly glider planes and so on. And there's so much money for it because the government knows that more and more people are not falling in line with their reasons for war, their reasons for militarism. So they're having to work really, really hard on recruitment. And that represents a shift in what military doctrine actually is. But yeah, I have a lot to say, so
Okay.
I will
Well, thank you
stop
so
there.
much. Um, we'll pass on then. Next, I'd like to introduce Sari Butter, who is council member at the Peace Pledge Union, which is one of the UK's oldest pacifist organisations who resist everyday militarism. They promote active non-violence and educate for peace. And one thing that they're particularly famous for is the White Poppy campaign, which I guess has kind of gained prominence over the last few years, but it's existed for quite a while. Sorry.
Hi, thank you, Paul. And it was really good to hear you, Jinsella. Thank you. And I'm going to come at this from a slightly different angle to Jinsella, but there are many connections and overlaps. But particularly, what I want to talk about is, Jinsella, you talked a lot about the culture, the way that we are normalizing, the logics that we use to make it inevitable that this is the way the world should be. So that's some of the stuff that I want to question in what I'm bringing in. Um, just also to add a little bit, I'm on the Peace Pledge Union Council, but I've spent my life doing conflict transformation and peace building and systemic justice work in war zones and in the UK and other countries. Um, there's quite a lot, and I'm very happy to share more, and with anyone afterwards who might want to contact me. That's very welcome. But what I'd really like to do is like really make an absolute clear and definite link between war and the climate crisis as not separate issues. And I think that's a really important role for all of us, but particularly educators. They are interconnected expressions of how power has been organized historically through colonization and continued today through systems that dominate people, land, and resources. And we've heard from Jinsella just now some of the ways that that is continuing through systems today. So what can look like separate crises actually have the same roots in domination of people, land, and resources. So let me just say a little bit more about these roots. So colonial systems actually reorganized the world around extraction of land and resources, control of labor and bodies, and then invented race and created racial hierarchies to justify both of those things. So Amy Césaire talks about colonization as thingification. It rendered all forms of life, nature, people, as other and as things to be consumed. And this continues today. What we often call development or security, again, Jinsella picked up on a lot of this, but what we call development or security still carries the logic of those colonial systems. So it's about control, extraction, and unequal distribution of harm. So fossil fuel extraction in historically colonized regions, global economic systems concentrating wealth and risk in particular places in the globe, with particular people with particular locations in the system, militarized borders protecting resources and those privileges of where wealth and risk is located, development models that continue this extractive logic. So let's go a little bit more into linking these. So war is always about who controls land, energy, and strategic resources. Always, it's always conflicts are always tied to oil, gas, and minerals, and military presence is often aligned with the resource regions, these resource regions. So we need to be really clear on this mythologizing and normalization of humanitarianism, when we need to be really clear that this is, people use phrases like projects of neo-imperialism and neo-colonialism. So climate breakdown, actually, we can actually use climate breakdown as a reveal for this system. Naomi Klein talks about climate change not just as an environmental issue, but as a civilizational wake-up call. It actually isn't just about the climate, it's about the whole ecosystem of life on this planet. So that's one way that as educators or any of us talking about this, we can go into this. So also we want to focus on the cycles of violence. So war accelerates climate breakdown, and climate breakdown intensifies the conditions for conflict. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change talks about climate acting as a threat multiplier. So climate stress equals instability. Instability leads to more conflict. At the same time, conflict equals more militarization, which equals more emissions and more destruction. So we're locked into this. This is another way that these are linked and locked into cycles. So we also need to think about who is impacted. As we know, those least responsible for emissions on the planet are generally global South communities and what we now term indigenous peoples. They are also the people most impacted by climate change and those most exposed to wars and violent conflicts and displacement. So there's real questions about who's on the receiving end of all of these crises, all of these issues, all of these violences. And in fact, Mary Robinson called climate change the greatest human rights challenge of our time, as a way of making that link. So we're looking at this intersection of climate displacement, conflict displacement, border militarization. These are all clearly linked. And coming back to what you were talking about, Jinsella, this cultural layer, what makes this stuff feel normal? So we really need to start questioning some underlying assumptions. The idea that security just equals control and military strength. The idea that land is resource rather than something to be in relationship with. The idea that some lives are more protectable than others. These are some of the underlying assumptions that we then build structures on. Some of the very structures that Jinsella was naming, the very policies and ways of organising our societies, our defence industry, of course, and our employment industry attached to a defence industry. So Robin Wall Kimmerer actually says, when we see land as community, we may begin to use it with respect. And so just to finish off, I just want to give a little bit more about so what does this mean for us and ask of us as educators? So first of all, I think what it's asking for is for us to really be loud and clear on supporting a shift in how we understand the problem. If war and climate crisis are connected through the same historic global systems of domination, extraction, and unequal power, then we are called to see them as patterns and symptoms of a whole system that need to be understood and addressed together. So this is asking us to move away from fragmented, compartmentalized thinking about issues and crisis to what I call having a systemic lens. We need to put our systemic goggles on and start seeing the systems and how they're interlinked. If we treat these symptoms separately, we're risking reinforcing the very system that produces them in the first place. So that's really clear. We want to teach historic connections, not silos. So if we don't teach the historic, the history of how these systems were built, we risk treating their outcomes as inevitable rather than actually created, therefore changeable. So we're linking climate, conflict, colonization, and power. We're helping learners see patterns across issues, including the ongoing effects of colonization, not just in the global south, but in our communities here in the UK. So without that, it's students and all of us are at risk of seeing these impacts as accidental rather than produced and created. So we also want to, what we can do is we can centre lived impact. So what I mean by that is moving beyond abstract issues, but actually bring in lived experience, linking real lives and real people to these conversations and what's actually happening. So who is living the consequences of all of this? What does it look like in real lives? What and who is being protected and what and who is being sacrificed? I would also, there's a couple more things. I would also say that our role is to help hold complexity and build the capacity to hold complexity. So we want to get away from false neutralities. This stuff, the system that we live in isn't neutral, and this stuff has just happened because we've gone down some accidental bad choices. Let's avoid this false neutrality. Let's start helping people to hold tensions, uncertainties, and multiple experiences together. Let's build our capacity to hold dilemmas and complexity more. So we're also not asking people to fix everything or carry guilt for any of this system. But what we're asking is to ourselves is to embody responsibility. So by that, I mean, let's try and locate ourselves within the system. So the question isn't who is guilty, but the question is, how are we positioned within these systems? Therefore, what responsibility follows? So what do I benefit from where I'm located in this system, living in the global north with a British passport, etc., etc., etc.? What do I benefit from? Therefore, what do I not see easily? Therefore, what is my situated responsibility? So from my location in the system, what could I make change and have influence about? How can we get students empowered about their locations in the system, and empowered and passionate about the impact that they could have by responding from their locations? And finally, it's about noticing what is normalized. The same systems that rely on extracting from land are the very same systems that justify violence to protect that extraction. So our task is to recognize these patterns, join the pieces together, question them rather than accept them as inevitable. And we're not trying to solve war or solve climate crisis, but we're trying to see more clearly the systems that connect them and to begin to respond in ways that reflect that understanding. So this requires collective learning and understanding, shared responsibility, and spaces where complexity can be held without us shutting down because it's overwhelming, it's tough, right? So we're trying to stay in relationship to these questions and these dilemmas together. And when we can do that, what becomes possible is clearer understanding and less polarization and responses that match the complexity. They can start to emerge. If we don't, we will create ongoing fragmentation, repeated patterns, and responses that treat systems but not causes. I'm going to stop there. I do actually have some activities that we can use in classrooms and any spaces, and I will share those, Paul, with you so that then you can make them available to everybody. But thank you so much, and I'm excited to hear more from you as well, Grace.
Hey, thank you so much. I mean, that was wonderful. I mean, I feel like there's so much breadth in what you've just explored there, and you've taken us on a journey, really. It's almost the journey that every teacher needs to go on. Every teacher needs to fundamentally explore what you've just described there before they even step into a classroom. Um, and because also the thing that excites me so much about what you've just described as well is where it takes us in terms of solutions is a completely different space. It isn't a techno fix. It isn't the system as it is. It's a really fundamental I think for us that's where we see education, the importance of education as an opportunity to be able to explore that and what I think that's a wonderful transition also to introduce Grace. So thank you so much, Sari. Um,
Thank you,
we will come
Sarri.
back and we'll talk about more of this in a minute. But I'm going to introduce Dr. Grace Lockrobin, who is Director of Philosophy and Education and Thoughtful Trainer at Thoughtful, which is the Society for Philosophical Inquiry. And Thoughtful improves learning and lives by developing the skills needed to thrive in school and society. And I think it's going to lead on wonderfully from everything that's been talked about so far. So, welcome,
I
Grace.
regret now going last because I thought I'll weave in together some of the rich things that have been said, and my notes are just all over the place with interesting ideas and avenues. There's no way I could possibly do justice and weave so much beautiful things and interesting and challenging things have been said. But what I will do, I think, is talk a little bit about practically how you might. Have how you might have lessons in schools that might allow any of this to be unpacked. And I'm sure I have certain terms for how I understand the pedagogy that I use that will resonate with people, even though they don't call it philosophical inquiry. But I'm going to propose to you that philosophical inquiry is a really rich, evidence-based pedagogy for having the kinds of conversations that make it possible to take the lid off some of this stuff that has been raised so far. And I'm going to help with a few visuals just to sort of help you follow. So the first thing just to say before I kick off is that Thoughtful, as we're now called, were for 35 years known as Sapere. So if you have ever come across us before, it will be with the name Sapere, and Thoughtful is our new name, but same mission. As Paul explained. So just a little word about philosophical inquiry. Philosophical inquiry is best understood as a pedagogy rather than a specialist subject. So this is not more rich knowledge that you need to add to your subject knowledge on top of your knowledge of the complex imperial and other and economic drivers that drive us towards war and climate destruction. It's a practice, a way of thinking for yourself, a way of thinking with others, a way of exploring concepts or ideas that arise in all areas of education and life experience. So philosophical inquiry can be used to tackle questions raised by climate destruction and destruction of nature and war, but also many questions of justice, social justice, colonialism, but also people's experience on children's experience on a really quite fundamental and human level, friendships and fairness and family and these kinds of issues. Our goal with philosophical inquiry, with P4C, is to create what we call a community of inquiry, community of philosophical inquiry. This is these are people, children often, who come together regularly to use dialogue, to think, to speak, to listen, to learn from each other, to live together. So this is quite a kind of ethically ambitious way of educating students. You can start to glimpse its sort of climate and sort of ecological benefits if we think about what kinds of communities and worlds we're trying to create. We're trying to, when we in a world that could withstand what's coming down the line for us. A world in which children could speak to each other, and adults indeed can speak to each other across difference and understand our common and different needs and wants. Brings us somewhat closer to the kind of communities we might want and need. Philosophical inquiry is really inclusive and adaptable. It's used by learners of all different kinds of needs and abilities and ages, including children who don't use verbal language, including people with special educational needs and disabilities. In fact, it allows children who come from a wide range of different lived experiences to try and speak and to illuminate others as to what it's like to be them and how they see the world That's really important in climate conversations. But I want to kind of double down on this idea that yes, we might be using philosophical content in the forms of these big ideas. We might be using philosophical method in the form of the critical approaches we use, but we should think of it as a practice rather than a subject. That's really important, I think. If you've ever seen PFC happening, you might see it happening like this. These are a load of Year 2 children from Sheffield. They're talking about nature in this inquiry, sitting in a circle, taking turns, talking about ideas. I'll share my slides via Paul later, but those who are watching this video can follow these QR codes to see what these children are talking about. A lot of my work has been about talking about the climate crisis. It's been a big passion of mine, though I'm not an expert in peace, I'm not an expert in climate, I'm just a philosophy educator, but I can and have used these tools to talk about these issues with children. This particular still is from a series of videos called Too Small to Make a Difference. And you can find the full set of clips via this QR code. During these discussions in Australia and in the UK, I was in the UK and my collaborator in Australia, we talked with children aged 9 to 14 about a range of questions about the climate crisis and their place in all of this. And one of the things you find that comes out of these conversations, these philosophical conversations, are that children, when they do use philosophy, use it to reflect on what matters to them and what they think makes life go well. So they are forming a sense of what the good life and a good life might mean and what a fair world might look like. This is really crucial, not just for exploring the topics of war and the topics of climate change, but for enacting the kinds of behaviours and values that might help lead us to a different kind of future. So what kind of things are we talking about in PVC that could possibly make connections between climate and war? Well, we're building a culture of dialogue in the classroom, online or online spaces where children get used to agreeing and disagreeing with each other. So one of the things we talk about in these videos are claims that people make, like one person can't change the world. Is it true that one person can't change the world? If it's false, then let's look at what it might possibly mean for change to be enacted. What counts as change? What is the only change that's sufficiently significant or worthy of merit, that changes the world? What do we actually mean? How do we measure that? These are statements that really quite young children can start to get engaged with and get their heads into. And we're giving them some of the language of agreement and disagreement that helps them to structure their thoughts and express themselves more clearly. As we do practice PVC more regularly, we start to build a space for respectful disagreement. Disagreement's the engine of dialogue in the classroom. Actually, we seek out what these disagreements might be, we put light on them, we explore them, and we find where they hold and don't. This particular activity, which you might try with your students, involves giving your students a statement that seems on the face of it really quite unproblematic, and then encouraging students to find cause to disagree with this statement. So here the statement is destruction of people is worse than destruction of nature. Sorry, slight typo there. What does this mean? And is destruction of people and nature separable? And are people not part of nature? And who's doing this destroying? And what is it about us that thinks that we can rank acts of destruction against each other in this way, in a meaningful way? So these kinds of tasks can help students to start engaging with these questions much more critically and with much more responsibility for where they stand in relation to these questions. Further things that we can do in philosophical inquiry is start to encourage children to ask much more challenging questions. And also we might ask those questions of the children ourselves. These, in relation to this question of the relationship between climate and war, might be questions like, do humans have a duty to protect nature during war? Is peace possible without environmental justice? Is environmental destruction, sorry, another typo, a consequence of war? Can it be a weapon of war? Is just war ever possible? Should harming ecosystems be regarded as a war crime? Is it legitimate on some level to go to war over scarce resources? Is war the inevitable price of ecological destruction? can we, as I alluded to earlier, prioritize people over the planet, or that makes no sense at all? So these kinds of questions can be ways in for students to start exploring the complexity of these issues. Notice that all of these questions are framed as open questions about which there might be some reasonable disagreement. So it's at the core of our pedagogy that we are non-directive in our facilitation. What this doesn't mean is that there is false neutrality about these issues. It doesn't mean that the teachers who employ P4C have no view about what's right in terms of climate justice, or that there are no facts on which to base your views about in response to these questions. Quite the contrary. I would really, and we do recommend when it comes to talking about challenging issues, that you equip yourself and your children with some of the kind of foundational knowledge about imperialism, about the economics of war that they need in order to get their teeth stuck into this from an informed position. But from a facilitative point of view, we try to engender in children the responsibility they need to tackle problems using their own emotional and intellectual and political resources, and not to direct them towards particular conclusions during the discussion. We don't do that. It's not because we think there aren't right and wrong answers. They certainly are in philosophy, and they are in these questions. But that children who are truly ethically educated in these issues need the to be able to arrive at really firm views using their own sort of intellectual resources. So that non-directiveness is the key part of our way of working. Because we operate with concepts, we make conceptual connections all the time, and the children think systemically. They think they constantly make relationships between the concrete lived experience and the concrete lived experience of others and abstract ideas. So there's a lovely interplay and movement backwards and forwards in the P4C discussion between the abstract and the concrete. There's a drive towards thinking in systems in terms of big explanations, thinking in terms of causality. Does the climate crisis cause war? Does war cause climate degradation? Both of those things are possible. How are the causation working? So this kind of systemic pattern-seeking thinking that Sarri was talking about earlier is really possible and quite naturally at home within philosophical inquiry. I think I'll leave that there in terms of how we might do it, and just go on to say that it is possible, and it does happen, that during philosophical inquiry we raise issues that are really quite difficult and scary for teachers to address. These discussions, if we're doing them properly, should engender really strong emotions. They do create quite polarizing positions. They do expose children to the harm of parroting what their parents or their adults in their lives have said, only to be held responsible for saying that stuff publicly. So we support educators to think quite carefully about what you do before, during, and after a discussion with this level of heat, in order to push your students in appropriate ways, and to try and hold space and keep them sufficiently safe in that public forum. So we spend a lot of time thinking about setting up a space, what kind of guidelines for dialogue are really going to be conducive, how to intervene with good judgment when students say things that are false, or they express ideas without respect. And also we support teachers to think about how to follow up with the right tools. Often that's providing your students with more sources of information, but often it's about providing them with the resources they need to emotionally decompress and to make bridges again with students where there's been difficulty and hurt caused. So it's sensitive business having these discussions, but we think that dialogic education that's philosophical is really apt. And just the final thing I'll say is the reason I think philosophical inquiry is so well positioned for these conversations is that they're so existential. They go right to the heart of what it means to be human and what our future looks like. I don't know how else you talk about those things except at that level. They're not scientific conversations, they're not geographical. Although all those things are really super relevant, they are fundamentally deeply ethical and existential, and philosophy is useful in that regard.
Thanks so much. I know Simon's put his hand up, but I did just want to mention a few things that you've mentioned there, and then maybe we can pass on to Simon and hear his thoughts. I think some interesting things at the end there, where you're mentioning around barriers for teachers and staff in terms of their confidence in the classroom and their, I guess, their perception that they don't know enough or are not trained enough to be able to facilitate these things, and then also these ideas of often there's nervousness in terms of the communities that they exist themselves, and saying or being blamed for doing or saying the wrong thing within the communities that they are part of. And the way that we perceive classrooms and educational spaces, maybe as, or we should maybe perceive them as outside of some of these more public politicized spheres, and that there are opportunities within those spaces. I think one thing that also comes through with a lot of the discussions and training that we have with teachers is teachers fearing sharing their own views and opinions. And we've often seen that that can be a very an interesting way to begin a discussion, is to foreground it with the idea of this is what I think, or these are my views, and then using that as a starting point. And there's pros and cons with framing it like that, but I think that also then helps young people to understand how teachers are human and have their own ideas, and but it's not necessarily that they're then forcing those on children. It's instead using those as a starting point. Um, should we start then with this wider discussion? Simon, would you like to come in?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. I'm Simon Shaw. I teach the comprehensive school in Redbridge, which is out to East London. I'm the NEU rep here, and I've also done, as Paul will hopefully endorse, quite a lot of work on climate education, and I absolutely endorse everything that was said. Sort of my philosophical starting point is Trotskyism, and Trotsky talked about the permanent arms economy, and that's something that I think we're existing with at the moment. War, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing. Is wrong, that song. It's absolutely at the epicenter of capitalism. Capitalism depends on war, and that permanent war economy is vital for capitalism. I think we've got a really difficult situation at the moment. I had a big argument with the Green Party when they came round, because I think we should withdraw from NATO. I think we should, and the Green Party equivocate on that. I think they're absolutely wrong. I think our security, and one of the speakers alluded it, comes from building climate resilience. We're far more at risk from climate risks than we are from any manufactured enemy. I'm not saying that the oligarchs and the populists all around the world aren't threatening, but first and foremost, and again, the speakers alluded to it, the people least responsible for the climate emergency are the ones who are getting the most impact. So, for instance, I live in Newham, and in Newham, we've got Newham City Airport, and the air quality there is amongst the worst in the UK, and it's one of the poorest communities, and that is fueled literally by the jet fuel of the people who jet in and out of London City Airport with absolute impunity. Our enemies don't come in small boats. It's an often a repeated cliche on the left. Our enemies jet around the world in private jets and cruise around the world in super yachts. So I absolutely 100% endorse everything, the analysis. The problem we've got is that as teachers in state schools, we've got very little professional autonomy. And we've not only very little professional autonomy, very little time. Because we need to be honest about it. First and foremost, teachers are working in exam factories, and we're accountable for our exam results. Now, I push the boat out as much as I can and be as subversive as much as I can. And sometimes that gets me into trouble. I've been in trouble because I've got this Palestinian bracelet on, and I wear Palestine colours, and I've got Palestine colours in my classroom. And that has led me to being in the head teacher's office. And he's a very tolerant man. And I've supported children who've flown the Palestine flag and taken action on behalf of Palestine. Now, that gets me into trouble. I'm old enough and robust enough to be able to push back against that. Thinking back, because I've been in this job a long time, I got into trouble in 2003. One of my students was parents wrote to the school, and I got myself into trouble because I'd said things about the Allies, so-called Allied invasion of Iraq and the ensuing genocide that racked up about 1 million Far Eastern lives. So it's really difficult for teachers to do these sort of things, and I do it more than most. But my younger colleagues won't go anywhere near this because they've got student loans to pay off. So I worry about what the speaker said. The practicalities of what you said are a long way away from what we do on a day-to-day basis. Surviving and getting through the curriculum and getting kids through this, the churn of the exam factory, are our major challenge. I've all but given up on climate education because without any allies, and Paul will know that I work with Tamwin quite closely, without that ally, I can't do it. I just can't do it. It's almost impossible. So can the speakers answer those points? Absolutely fantastic. Somewhere over here, I've got Gramsci's quote, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the heart. And that's my mantra. But I'm finding it very difficult to maintain that optimism because there's no time, there's no space. People are scared, and the genocide in Palestine doubled down on that. So many colleagues in the NEU were sanctioned as a result of taking action with their students on behalf of our Palestinian sisters and brothers and the children in Palestine. Because not only was there a genocide in Palestine, there was an absolute deliberate, and an ecocide. There was an absolute deliberate attack on on schools and educational institutions. I'll stop there because I could go on for too long.
You, Simon. I know there's so much more that you've not talked about with your work with Care for Calais, and I know that the NEU has done some work in this space. I wonder, does anyone want to respond? Grace?
Yeah. One of the things I want to say is that the fact that philosophical inquiry takes a non-directive approach can be extremely useful for educators who are expected to perform a kind of political neutrality in the classroom. So while we all know that there are, among all of our colleagues in education, there are passionate views about different political and ethical issues, including social justice issues, this particular form of ethics and civic education is about children exploring their own views and enacting their own values. And so it can allow educators with the confidence and training to open up these discussions without being battered with the same kinds of critiques about leading children to conclude certain things that seem to be kind of politically objectionable at that moment. So I think it can be quite a useful pedagogy in that respect. But also, I don't just propose philosophical inquiry as a kind of way to kind of fly under the radar and act as though one is neutral. It's central to my doctoral research on ethics education that we need to morally instruct children about the dangers and evils of capitalism and imperialism and colonialism and the history that has led us to the point where we have these extractive logics and things. All that's really, really important instruction, important education. That can be hard for teachers to teach because it's seen potentially as really quite partisan or polarized by some people. Okay, even though I think it's not. But we don't just need instruction. It's children who have just been instructed in what to believe and what to think and what to act and what is right, are not sufficiently ethically educated. They also need, through ethical inquiry, to develop the good judgment to be able to look at novel and complex situations and decide for themselves and together with others. And ethical inquiry is where you develop that extra responsibility and that extra fine judgment in order to be able to navigate complicated situations, both the ones we encounter now and the ones that are down the road for us. So I think that creates a second argument for teachers that this particular way of working is not only not polarized and putting the teacher in a difficult position, but it's also precisely what children need in order to be ethically educated. And just on the final thing, how the hell do you fit any of this in? A lot of the work that we do is about finding tiny pockets for dialogic teaching within the existing curriculum. We know that you can't go, oh, we're off timetable, lads, we're just going to do an hour of debate about Gaza. We know that schools can't do that, but they can ask questions like that brief thumbs up and thumbs down, do you think one person can make a difference? They can speak to a neighbour for 5 minutes and then have a bit of class discussion, popcorn for another 5 minutes. And that builds a culture of pockets of dialogue. And it's not enough, but it's definitely better than nothing.
We're also, I guess, seeing this curriculum and assessment review that potentially there may be more opportunities. I know citizenship in primary schools may be an opportunity to develop more of this.
And also the oracy, the idea that there's going to be an oracy strategy woven all the way through beginning to school, all the way through to leaving school, is going to create, supposedly, an expectation that teachers prioritise more dialogic teaching and more opportunity for talk. What are we going to talk about? Loads of options, but some of these really important ethical and political issues might be the perfect excuse, in inverted commas, to practice oracy, whilst at the same time serving those very discussions that you know your students ought to have. Because if they're not talking about the relationship between climate change and war in your classroom, or they're talking about what they think about Gaza, where are they talking about that? Well, they're talking about it in a more polarized and less informed fora. And so school is the place for these conversations. We've just got to find the tiny pockets to squeeze it in, because we know we're not going to have an hour, and we're not going to necessarily be protected to have it in a really open forum. We're going to have to do it with a bit of savviness.
Sorry, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I'd love to just expand to add to that. First of all, Simon, thank you for being so clear on what in your where you're located in the system, what is accessible and possible, and where you're pushing at the edges, and where you're being limited and struggling. It's really important that we keep sharing where we are, what our experiences are from where we're all located, and this is what I mean by putting on this systemic lens. So let's not fall into the trap of hyper individualization, which is part of this domination system, right? Let's come back to the collective. So what's our collective responsibility alongside alongside what Grace just shared about how do we do this within schools? For me, conflict transformation is all about multiple entry points. We need multiple entry points for everything. So I'm also interested in where you're located in the system, Simon, in this, what you call the exam factory, this utter ridiculous pressure to get through people through a curriculum within their time, your class time. What we need to work together, actually, more collectively, those of us that do some form of educating outside of the exam factory, we're located differently in the system. What do you need from your location from us, and what do we need from you from our location? This is the kind of stuff that we need to do. So in your local areas, Simon, I think you said Redbridge, right? And there's not many youth clubs left anymore. There's certainly not many detached youth workers around, right? And generally, I mean, not just Redbridge, but where are the people who can do educating and philosophical inquiry and other types of conversation like this and dialogue outside of your classroom? What do you need them to pick up that you can't do? What can't they do that you could pick up in your classrooms? This is the kind of stuff. People like me that do get called in to support organizations, groups, community groups. What can we organize in our communities? I can just, some of the things I do is just sometimes come in and do one-off community conversations. Like there's so many different places and people and possible ones of us that could come at this from different angles. So one of the things I'm really keen is how we don't need to be able to do everything on our own. It's the system that wants us to think that. Let's rebel against that. Let's reject that. Let's interrupt that thinking. Let's come together collectively, because I really believe that there are ways we can do that. And if we need to start having more conversations together, about this of this ilk, of this vein, I'm really ready to start having them. So I hope that's helpful as well.
the thing that then raises with me that Grace had mentioned earlier as well is that scale of where you're sort of enacting some of this, and the idea that actually it's at the micro level within a classroom or between two people, and that actually that scaled to the country level or to is actually the same sort of philosophical idea, and that if you can then shift someone's thinking at the smallest of scales, that can have a knock-on impact. And maybe there's a similar story in terms of then we're saying, well, there are micro moments within a lesson, and it's about the way that you explore a situation or the pedagogy that you use to explore that. And then as a school, kind of how you then might look at conflict and community and identity, that then is a way of sort of manifesting a different way of thinking on an alternative that then opens up people's imaginations at different scales. Tom, I'm aware that you've had your hand up for a while, Tom.
No worries. Yeah, my name's Tom. I'm Paul's colleague in the southwest for the Ministry of Eco. It's just a very short one, but this talk of militarization, I've only just watched Mr. Nobody versus Putin, and I think for particularly secondary schools, using that as a stimulus and a resource for all of these philosophical conversations that need to flow from that would be a really useful stimulus. It's a very frightening documentary, but it really, I think, if young people can see the seeds of what happens in that documentary in this country, it maybe will raise some alarm bells about, are we becoming over militarized? And I just wanted to say about the talk about systems, and I totally endorse that is the way we need to train young minds, is we need to be able to be interconnected thinkers and support them in that. But that was it. Thank you.
Sorry, did anyone else want to come in with any other thoughts? Otherwise, sorry, Jinsella,
Yeah,
yes.
sorry. I just give a few final comments.
Yeah, please. And what we might do then is move between each of you. So this will be a chance if Grace and Sarri, if you wanted to have some thoughts. Sorry, yeah, Jinsella.
First of all, on what Simon was saying, I think I really echo what Sari was, how Sari responded to that in relation to. It's really interesting to hear that. We obviously get that assumption, but we do need to do more work to be asking each other what our needs are, what our capacity is. But what we do at Demilitarise Education is we focus on policy. All your schools are governed by certain frameworks, and understanding what those frameworks are enable us to look at what accountability mechanisms could be put in place. So that would be an interesting exercise, perhaps. I'm presuming you're affiliated with Disarm Education, the NEU group, who, yeah, we supported with some of their research strategy. I think they're doing incredible work, and it'd be great to understand what that collective is thinking as educators in state schools and beyond, like how they actually think that these narratives can be questioned, and how this perpetual war narrative can be brought to an educational space without it. Oh, great. Yeah, please do. Yeah, without it being too polarizing. But yeah, if anyone needs kind of help analyzing and looking at the way policy is governing and creating and dissolving space for these discussions, then please do get in contact with us. And yeah, I love the film idea as well. Like, I remember from my school experiences, those stories are what really stick.
Well, thank you. Should we jump quickly over? Was that sorry about disarm? Have a moment just to talk about so the NEU campaign around.
Hi, thanks. My name's Kaelan. I'm an NEU member. I'm a secondary school teacher, and I'm a committee member at Disarm Education. So very much inspired by organisations like Jinsella's. What makes us different from Forces Watch and Demilitarise is that we focus specifically on arms companies and schools. We're doing a sort of mass FOI project at the minute, and that's to be published shortly. But about 47% of secondary schools we've found so far have some sort of relationship with a private arms manufacturer. Obviously, so they're deeply embedded within schools. But one of the things we find is that it is actual, the NEU affiliated to Disarm Education last year as part of a Palestine motion. And as a result, in place at my school and others, we've been able to sort of end these relationships. Just on the idea of the frameworks, one of the ways that I did it was in my school was to talk about us being not just the union affiliation, which helped, but the idea of it being as a Catholic school and has these supposedly Catholic values. One of the things we brought up obviously was ideas around peacemaking, but also a big thing was care for our common planet. And the idea that the military industrial complex is hugely damaging to the environment, and also about how BA systems are the most deeply embedded organization within schools, are really profiting off of the climate crisis as well, in terms of contracts for like aid sites. So they're dropping bombs in places, but they're also winning contracts for the sort of aid planes to bring in food and things like that as well. So it's been interesting organizing tool for a lot of people within their own workplaces to talk about these issues around militarization, and the idea of taking action against militarization in your school obviously opens up other questions. Just one last thing, because we're so deeply embedded in sort of careers, this is the main sort of way in which private weapons companies are coming into schools. It raises questions about what's the alternative. And I think really pushing the idea of just transition, the sort of STEM washing that they do, the BAE STEM schools packs and those sorts of things, putting out to people that all of the skills needed to make a bomb can be used to make a dialysis machine or a wind turbine. Is a really compelling argument. And also the idea that the weapons industry is really in decline, has been massively since the 1980s. Whereas if you look at something like 15 years ago, there were 10,000 people working offshore wind. That's nearly 70,000 now. So the sort of good green industries are going like this, but they just don't have the same lobbying and that BAE or Lockheed Martin have. But yeah, I'll drop a link to our website in as well. And we're doing the Workplace Day of Action on Thursday with the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. So we'll have about 100 teachers having disarm education meetings in their schools this week. And hopefully that will sort of have a bit of a butterfly effect in various schools up and down the country. And we'll be having these sorts of conversations on a much bigger scale going forward.
Well, thank you. I think, you've raised this really fundamental idea as well of community, and the idea that educators shouldn't be seen as these sort of islands, that it's about coming together and sharing practice and building confidence and collectively working. You're talking about the freedom, the FYI stuff. That sounds really interesting as well, the freedom of information requests and things. The other one that came to mind there was that so many schools have got the language and terminology that they associate with their school values, and often a handful of words and the often taken at face value and quite superficially, but actually so much of what we've talked about is woven through that language and terminology, and this is a way to be able to maybe enact this in your schools. And just when you were talking about frameworks and how you might engage with this in your school community, should I just pass over to you for something?
What would be good I haven't got particular things to come back on. What would be good to go into?
Or just one point that you think, if you're going to take away one thing from this, what might it be, or the thing that's at the front of your mind at the moment?
Yeah, right. It's been really beautiful to hear, and I'd love to hear. It'd be great if there were more people in the room, even so that we could really get into more and more discussion. But one of the things that is coming up for me is it's really clear that we need to be courageous now. We need to be courageous. I'm not suggesting for one moment that we may not have been being courageous for some time, but maybe the threshold for those of us, for people who have struggled to be courageous, but it's that quote, and I don't know who said it, but if not if not when now, if not us, then who? It feels a bit like that. And so I'm really wanting to think about, how do we push at the edges of is what we already can do and where our limits are, how we do it, and how we need to actually refresh and rethink how we might be doing it. Thank you, Simon, for the quote. And also really it's almost like be willing to suspend what we already know as well, to start really, it's more what you would call philosophical inquiry, Grace. It's a time for us to actually recheck, how are we doing things the way that we've always done things? If we are, it's a time to interrupt that, and dare I say it, be radical. Again, I'm not suggesting that anyone here hasn't been being radical before, but there's something here about the call to arms, the call to action is, how do we try and do that more collectively? How do we join up collectively? And for me, I'm really clear, is we cannot do this on our own. We cannot do this in our silos. So even one conversation with, for example, Simon, you put that out here on the chat that you're organising something, just one thing like that. We don't have to try and change everything all in one go, but even one conversation with someone we know that might have other types of educational or dialogue spaces or influential spaces with not just young people but adults too. I'm even now sitting here thinking, we've just got some funding in the PPU for educational work, but that doesn't have to mean schools work. Education is a really big thing. I'm suddenly thinking, right, I wonder if there's a way that we can do some version of detached youth. About 30 years ago, I used to do detached youth work, where my job was just to walk around the streets and talk to young people about what's going on in their lives and see if I could support in any way. What if we could start doing our own versions of that? I mean, I was employed by my local Greenwich local authority when I was younger to do that, but why can't we do that ourselves? So there's something for me here about this is, I mean, look at us all in the room. Let's keep inspiring each other. Let's keep listening to each other, and let's keep this sort of this collective lens and coming in at multiple entry points together. That doesn't feel particularly new or profound, but that's what I'm feeling right now from this conversation. I hope that's helpful in some way.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. Thank you. Grace.
One point of connection is thinking about where these conversations happen, and I come in speaking about schools because I thought that might be sort of helpful for the audience, but it really sparks me to think, what are the last 3-4 climate conversations that I've had? Most recent one was in a gallery in an exhibition all about the history of climate change and art created around climate change in Sheffield. Prior to that, there were discussions online with home educated children from around the world. Prior to that, I've done work after the school strikes that happened pre-COVID. I put on public philosophy open events for free and advertised them, and people came after school strikes and had these public conversations. So there are other avenues for that are educational in spirit but aren't necessarily in schools, and possibly some avenues for schools-based educators who feel frustrated like there isn't the opportunity to have these conversations in their day job. There might be space outside to have those conversations. But one more thing to say about philosophical inquiry, which is that philosophical inquiry is being described as philosophy in education, but it's actually a philosophy of education. It's a reimagining of what if education was about asking, what kind of world do we want to live in? What kind of things do we hold dear? And what do they look like when we really enact them? So these deep ethical, epistemic, kind of philosophical questions it really challenge how schools can be and how communities can be. So I feel now in my work that merely having these kind of conversations is part of fighting the climate crisis and fighting some of the other logics that are kind of extractive and destructive and drive wedges between us as human beings. So And I know not all of this work needs to be kind of solution focused, but I feel like that is a form of being an activist as a teacher, to find the little moments in the day to give your children intellectual space to connect with each other and to address the things that concern them most about the world.
Well, thank you. I think that's a really good summary as well. That's a good point to sort of finish on. I've made some notes, but you've essentially said what I was thinking there, Grace. There's so much that we can do in terms of small acts that we then can be seen as a sort of climate action. I often think climate action is a slightly dismissive term. I think this is far more all-encompassing, but actually people should sort of perceive it as part of that jigsaw. We are going to make an effort to share everything that has been spoken about and talked about. We'll share it via email and also add it to the description when we share this recording. It's been so lovely to bring some people together, I think, that wouldn't necessarily have met or spoken. And I really hope that this then also leads to some further conversations. And we've already talked about that with Simon's offer of speakers. And yeah, let's hope that this leads to more action. Well, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much. Lovely to meet you all.
Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you to all of the people who are in the room and who will listen to this later for everything that you're doing to just keep this happening. Really, really, we all need each other. So I'm really grateful. Yeah. Thank you.